Hello, and welcome to another Northstar Talks Politics. This series really seems to be taking off. If some of you were clear on this because of the naming, this is a series. I have a number of other videos, varying quality. Sometimes I have a series of thoughts and I gotta get them out in a video before they fade from my head because I have long COVID and memory issues, so I can't retain stuff as long. Plus, I don't have the really video editing skills yet or access to good software program or artistic skills to create a lot of fancy graphics, so I don't have that to wait for, which may otherwise be a reason to not immediately move into making a video. So anyways, sorry, brief pause there. I wanted to talk today a little bit about classes. Uh, Specifically, you probably have all heard of there being different classes in society, but let me put it this way, and this will probably be in the title. What you think you know is wrong, inaccurate. If you don't have a lot of Marxist education or theory, especially, but even if you do, a lot of people have a very shallow understanding of classes, upper, middle, lower class. That's a bullshit set of terms. It's far too broad, and intentionally, they create these three groups so they can say we're all middle class. You literally would get 75% of Americans self-identifying as middle class, which is nonsense. It's an attempt at a way to manipulate the public, control their opinions, control their voting patterns, because America is not really a democracy, but the way it's not really a democracy involves a public that's so thoroughly manipulated by political advertising and shells that are paid for with billionaire money, right-wing think tanks, stuff like that, capitalist think tanks, that there's not a prayer of people actually exercising their own self-interest or voting in a way other than the interest of the capitalist class. But it still requires that manipulation because ostensibly people could otherwise just go and all vote against the interests of the rich and form a third party because both the Democrats and Republicans are thoroughly controlled in the United States. Neither is a way to progress, but if people all worked together and they were free of these manipulations, they would probably form additional parties and completely kill off the Democrats and Republicans. By which I mean, if that wasn't clear, they'll make the parties cease to exist. I don't mean violence. I mean that these parties will die off as political entities in the United States, be replaced by other parties that will, elect their candidates instead. Do not misinterpret what I was saying there. That will not happen very easily, though, or probably ever at all, because the two-party system works for the capitalist class. They increasingly, the very rich, control education, so forth. Um, Education is increasingly being privatized. It's underfunded. There's right-wing think tanks that work to astroturf opposition to certain agendas and control what textbooks go into schools. So, yeah, the system is messed up, and this three-class structure is bullshit. It's one of the ways they control people. But who is they? First of all, need to start by a graphic would probably be useful for this. Imagine a very tall, slender triangle. This pyramid of class structure, but it's not, you see these broad-based pyramids, it's almost like a church steeple, realistically. It's almost straight up. If the vertical distance represents differences in political and economic power, there's vast differences between the tippy top and the bottom. And at the top, the very tip of the steeple, is the bourgeoisie. People often misinterpret that they think their boss is bourgeoisie. No, chances are, unless you work directly for Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, your boss is not bourgeoisie. Those are people who live almost entirely off of the incomes of capital gains and investments. They may technically work, but they get very little of their income from their work. It's their privileged position. People like Musk could stop working tomorrow and they would never, ever, ever want for anything because they have so much in the way of stocks, bonds, economic control. That's the bourgeoisie. They make up 0.1 to 0.2% of the population, but they probably control around 20 to 25% of the wealth and political power in society, via various means. Their actual wealth share might calculate differently, but you have to consider that some of it's hidden, Cayman Islands, that kind of thing. So often attempts to quantify their wealth end up lowballing what they actually control because it doesn't look at all the wealth they've successfully hidden from taxes and such, which is not going to show up in these studies. Even a very conservative study probably put them at over 17% of the wealth, and it's definitely over 20% to 25% of the political power. These people hold as much political power, sometimes in the case of the very top of the high bourgeoisie, the billionaires, as 10,000, 100,000 Americans of lesser class. The multimillionaires, it's less extreme. They might hold as much as 250, 200. So as a group, they average around 25%, maybe 250 times the political power of the average American in the US, for instance, or in many other countries it's similar. But that's as a group, and that averages in multimillionaires who are far more numerous than the billionaires and drag the average down to almost their level. People like Bezos at least have as much power. If you asked a politician whether they have support of just full hard support of Jeff Bezos or 10,000 people, they would say Jeff Bezos. So that's a level of their idea of their political control and power. Now, below that, there's two classes. They are not successive levels in this pyramid. People often envision them as such, or assume they're such if they don't see a visual representation. This is why I really do wish, at least for this part, I had time to at least do a little quick paint document graphic. Unfortunately, I have to deal with narcissistic and abusive family members who are trying to oppose my time and would distract me, so I wouldn't get this video out at all. I'm disabled long COVID, so I'm in a bad living situation. If I took the time to try and do that graphic, I wouldn't have been able to make this video at all, so I apologize. But below that, though, there are two classes side by side, um, approximately equal, but with rather different interests: the petty bourgeoisie and the labor aristocracy. Under many Marxist theories, these may be considered, petty bourgeois might be their own class, some people might say, or they might be considered lumped in with the bourgeois, and the labor aristocracy, the proletariat. So I'm not going to say whether they're a separate class. We're talking Marxist subclasses. These are very definitely distinct subclasses from everyone else. The petty bourgeoisie are like small business owners, shopkeepers, executives who make a substantial fraction of the money from stocks, bonds, investments, but they still work. Um, the people with just $1 million, who, if you had $1 million, you invest at 6% ROI. If you could invest all your money, because some of you need just to live, would give them $60,000 in income from investments in a year. But they would, they want to live at like a $250,000 lifestyle or $150,000 lifestyle. They still have to do work for the majority of their income. But a substantial fraction of these people's wealth, power, control, the petty bourgeoisie, comes from controlled means of production: factories, mines, farms. And while I explained the bourgeoisie, or properly the high bourgeoisie or true bourgeoisie, that 0.1 to 0.2% control around a fifth to a quarter of society's political power, and they could never control society on their own because they're just not numerous enough, and they know it. The petty bourgeoisie and the labor aristocracy together might make up 10 to 20% of the population, but they control at least 40% of the political power in society. So together with the high bourgeoisie, they can maintain their control. And this varies from country to country, society to society. If the power of the high bourgeois, the capitalist class, is in jeopardy, they will often expand on the control and power of the labor aristocracy with doing things like expanding the military and police forces of a country, because people like the police chiefs and commissioners, the officer corps of an army, those groups are labor aristocracy, and by expanding the numbers of them, they can have more people to help keep down the lower classes, so that it's not a mere 60% political power they control, it's 70, 75. You can see this in like Latin American countries. Uruguay, when it was tending towards an authoritarian regime and became around 1974, there was a fascist coup basically, and it went from what was already a right-leaning government somewhat, although there was a insurgent left, there was a left that was in great danger of winning power via democratic means, with Marxist parties getting more and more of the vote each year, to, like a fascist dictatorship that hunted and tortured and killed. If you're interested in a little bit of the lead up to that, there's a great movie, State of Siege. It's by a French director who is he is French Greek. He was ethnically Greek. His father or grandfather were Marxists in Greece. When the British came in and subverted democracy in Greece and forced an authoritarian regime. Some people falsely call it fascist. It wasn't fascist, but it was a monarchist, authoritarian, absolute monarchy regime that was forced on Greece by the British crown after World War II, by the British Empire, the British crown, the British state. Churchill was very much behind this. When you had the Yalta Conference and divided up how the war would go after World War II, Greece was put in the Western sphere of influence. So even though the left, that's Marxist, and center left, that is Social Democrats, had an enormous amount of political sway in Greece, and a legitimately representative government would have had a left or center left government, because of the danger of that turning into communism. The British unleashed literal Nazi garrisons on protesters. And partisans. They put their absolute king was a relative of the British crown. It was like George the something, to make it very clear. And anyways, this guy, he moved to France because he was barred based on his parents' political beliefs from attending university in Greece by this authoritarian right-wing regime. So he moved to France. He went to university. He became a film director. Great movie. And that kind of the vastly expansive police force of Uruguay going into the late 70s, and the expansion of the police and military in Latin American countries are often to keep the people down, is a great example of how the labor aristocracy can be sometimes expanded when the needs of the capitalist class dictate it. In the military, keep in mind, it's not everyone is in the military, it's not labor aristocracy. It's the officer corps. Sometimes, if the needs of the bourgeois are very desperate, the higher non-commissioned officers, or if it's really institutionalized, like in the United States, there are these guys. Hold on, I forgot to pull this one up. There's these people like the Sergeant Major of the Army, SMA, Michael R. Weimar right now. Sergeant Major of the Army is a unique non-commissioned rank and position in the United States Army. The holder rank and position is the most senior enlisted soldier in the Army. There's like a Sergeant Major of the Army. There's something similar in Navy, Air Force. Basically, these guys are technically non-coms, but they hold a level of political and economic power that's on the level of labor aristocracy normally, and greater than many junior officers, more than a second lieutenant or a first lieutenant in the Army, for instance. Better pay, more political power. One of those people would easily hold as much power as, almost high bourgeois levels. If you asked a politician would they rather have the endorsement of the Sergeant Major of the Army or 200 Americans, they would probably say Sergeant Major of the Army. It'd be close, I think. So it's not Jeff Bezos levels of power, but it's approaching the lower ranks, the high bourgeois in terms of levels of political power, though, not economic power. They very much labor aristocracy. So very highest segments of the non-commissioned officers, most of the commissioned officers, they would generally be considered labor aristocracy. And a lot of the police forces, especially if the police are especially well paid and prevented from being held accountable for crimes, in a police state, the police are obviously labor aristocracy. So, and there are a lot of police states in Latin America that were anti-communist police states, put in place by the CIA, a series of coups throughout the 60s, the 70s, going back to the 50s, and even before communism, it was the main threat. They were, before the Great Depression, the U.S. was doing all these coup-making things to put, coup-making operations to put right-wing governments in power throughout Latin America. And consistently, repeatedly, universally, labor aristocracies were expanding these countries to keep the proletariat, the vast majority of people, down. So, right, we've only so far covered 10 to at most, when it's expanded, 20% of the population We've already seen more than half the political power in society. So where's the other 80% of the society and 40% of maybe up to half of the political power in society? That is, it's usually not half. So let's say another 40%, maybe even less. That's the proletariat classes. But just saying there's just the proletariat is often, it's overly reductionist, and even Marxists themselves didn't. I mean, sometimes the labor aristocracy might be considered a subset of that, but there's another group. I forgot to pull up. There's nonsense. I wish the Oxford Languages Dictionary would be pulled because it's reactionary shit, and on Marxist issues, it's intentionally misdefines terms. In Marxist theory, the lumpen proletariat is underclass, devoid of class consciousness. It talks about the sympathy to counter-revolutionary forces, uh, and honestly, that goes more, I think, to Marx's analysis of the failure of the Paris Commune and a personal biases against the very, very poor than anything that's a legitimate, honest class analysis, and it was carried forward into some of Engels' works. But elitism aside, the proletariat still has two divisions: the proletariat proper and the lumpen proletariat. The lumpen proletariat are the individuals who are very vulnerable, the homeless, the people who are barely holding on to housing, often unemployed, the disabled. Technically, many people would consider me that as someone who's disabled. And many of them, but not all, I'm a socialist, I'm disabled. Um, and I've been all over the map. I was on the verge of becoming labor aristocracy, becoming a physician, when I became disabled and wasn't able to achieve the goal of becoming a physician. It wasn't about wealth or status. I wanted to help people. Um, uh, I, obviously, most of my background would have been considered proletarian, and now I'd technically be considered open proletarian, but I'm a socialist. I've been all over the maps, rubbed elbows with a lot of petty bourgeois and labor aristocracy people, um, due among other things to family connections. Like most people, I've never met a member of the high bourgeoisie. I've never sat down with a billionaire, but pretty much every other group I've spent a considerable amount of time, and they really are distinct groups with distinct interests. I've had a roommate who was like son of a cop and all this cop culture stuff, and oh god, he does not realize how reactionary his views were. But I wasn't going to challenge that guy, and he was otherwise a pleasant person. Best not to upset any in that case. But anyways, the lumpen proletariat often will also end up siding with the high bourgeois, even though their interests are not necessarily aligned as much. Say the labor aristocracy, because these are people who are so desperate that they can easily be wiped out, killed by the state just withdrawing a little bit of support from them. This is like, if food stamps are abolished, I would probably end up eventually starving to death. Now I'm disabled. I have no ability to work. This YouTube channel has not made it to the point where it's producing any ad money yet. So food stamps are necessary for me to eat. Medicaid is necessary for me to get healthcare, however shitty the care is, because doctors don't often provide people on Medicaid good healthcare. And they're supposed to not discriminate, but they often find ways to do so anyways, to figure out who is on Medicaid and treat them terribly, or who they suspect. And sometimes even you can have better health care, but they think you're on Medicaid, and so they treat you poorly because they technically don't know. Which is why people will go to doctors and they'll wear like suits. Sometimes you'll see older people, they'll put on their best clothes because they're worried about getting lumped in with the poor people on very bad health insurance, and being given substandard care. It's just like people used to wear suits when they flew for different reasons, but it's an old person thing. Uh, lumpen proletariat, though, because they're desperate, they will sometimes betray the interests of the rest of the proletariat, just for whatever scraps the very, very rich might throw their way, so they can survive a little longer. This isn't always the case, and there are people who will nobly sacrifice themselves if necessary to see the interests of a better society come into fruition. This is where, ignoring that there's people like that, some of the poorest, most desperate people, sometimes they have nothing to lose and will take the opposite stance of, you can't do any more to hurt me. Screw you, billionaire. Fuck you, Jeff Bezos. Um, and that's where I would fall, and someone like me would be in that school of thought. But there are a lot of people lump in proletariat. I've met people who, I don't want to change this, I don't want to see revolution in the country or any big changes or protests. They're afraid of Black Lives Matter and such because those people were always thinking about how it might disrupt maybe their access to food stamps and whatnot. They're putting their survival above everyone else's needs. So the proletariat can often become class traders of a sort. And when you combine that with the maybe 60% of the political power that's already held by the high bourgeois, the petty bourgeois, and labor aristocracy, and there's always some proletariat who will vote against their own class interests, now you've got a very solid 70 to 75% of of political power in the hands of the bourgeois between the people that can fool in the proletariat to vote against their own interests, maybe half the lumpen proletariat who will betray the class interests, the labor aristocracy will mostly vote with the interests of the rich. That we do have to now draw a finer distinction because I've talked in very broad terms. In the U.S., there's two political parties: the GOP and the Democrats. They tend to draw their support from different segments of the population, while both are essential parties are ultimately controlled by the high bourgeois, and kind of split that class in half, where, or not really even split. Most will receive money from. There may be many billionaires who donate to both parties, but they will show preference for one party or another. And maybe half tend prefer one party, half prefer the other, but they will all vote. I mean, most all of them will donate to both parties. So they're both, in the end, really high bourgeois parties. But in order to put together a governing coalition of political power within the country, in order to maintain their whole power, they need more than that. The GOP has increasingly tended towards reactionary sentiments, now increasingly sliding into fascism. They tend to draw from the petty bourgeoisie, who, in Marxist theory, and petite bourgeoisie, there's a whole section on it, role in fascism. The petite bourgeois tend to get crushed as capitalism advances. Monopolies become enormous and use their economies of scale and their ability to, in one particular region of a country, operate at a loss to drive other businesses out of power, and then jack up prices once they've driven all the small businessmen out of business, stuff like that. They get crushed over time. They become fearful. They become absolutely ripe for being turned to reactionary sentiments. The GOP gets a lot of their political power from the petite bourgeois. No, not everyone. There's small business owners who are diehard Democrats, but you cannot assume the entire class all operates in a given way. But they have a tendency towards fascism and reactionary sentiments. They're perfect for the Republican Party. The Republican Party favors the petite bourgeois as their group that they work with alongside the high bourgeois to control society. And of course, there's always some proletariat who vote against the class interests. They tend less to do the whole lumpen proletariat class trader thing because they defund welfare systems. Then you have the labor aristocracy. The labor aristocracy, this would be like junior doctors who don't have their own private practices, or even more senior, but they work in a hospital. They're not an employer. Some people who have small private practices may hire nurses, secretaries, etc. These are more the doctors, and they would technically be considered petit bourgeois. The doctors and lawyers are one of the groups that blur the lines between labor aristocracy and petit bourgeoisie, which matters in terms of relations to means of production, but not so much in terms of level of economic and political power. But these will be a lot of the doctors who are not really small businessmen, and lawyers who are junior lawyers don't own their private practices, many engineers, many academics. Professors tend to be Democrats in the United States, which leads to the GOP say, oh, professors are all leftists. No, they're not leftists. That's not what leftist is. Democrats are basically a center-right party, and the Republicans are a far-right party. There's not even really a true centrist party in the United States. Maybe you could consider Democrats that, but they're not left in any sense. But this is, anyways, the labor aristocracy are the independently theorized by Bakunin and Engels. I would argue that Bakunin's definition is a little more internally consistent than Engels' definition. Friedrich Engels, Michael Bakunin, but regardless of who is participating to find the firm, and Lenin worked on it, And talked about its relations to imperialism. The fact is, the labor aristocracy in the United States tends to more favor the Democrats. They don't get their income from exploiting others directly. They get it from collaboration with the very rich and from having jobs that are highly skilled, and they often think it's due to their own personal merit and work ethic and intelligence, not so much that the rich will intentionally allow some of these jobs to be paid better and not try and say crush doctors into poverty, which is actually starting to happen in the United States with health insurance and private hospital networks and stuff are actually starting to proletarianize physicians, so they're losing their labor aristocracy position even, which actually makes them more ardently tend towards the Democrats who oppose this. It's more of a GOP thing, but they're worried about losing their privileged position in society, but at the same time, they don't get it from exploiting others. They blame different people. They tend to be more socially progressive. Democrats, labor aristocracy. Then the Democrats also play the game of doing the lumpen proletariat class trader thing, where they get a certain segment of the very, very poor to vote for them no matter what by promising to protect and expand, though they almost never actually expand, but to protect welfare systems so that some of the very, very poor, the lumpen proletariat in society who are struggling to survive, will vote for them, even if many of them might correctly realize Democrats don't really represent the interests of them or most of the lower classes generally, and are ultimately part of the ratchet effect with the Republican Party, which really quickly, this is something, there's going to be all this far right stuff trying to either deny it um, or talk about it in other contexts to try and distract from its main purpose. But the ratchet effect is a concept in sociology and economics, illustrating the difficulty with reversing a course of action once a specific thing has occurred. Specifically, you're going to see a very broad version, like things with famine, cycles, consumer products here. But the most common version in the United States, let's try this because that's more international, is the role of the, and this is a guy who thinks that voting is pointless. He's dumb. You can still vote with third party and make a symbolic protest, even if you do realize the two parties, neither of them have your interests at heart. But he does write, and you can read about what he has to say about how the Democrats act as a ratchet. They prevent uh, the Republicans make things worse. They cut taxes on the rich, they cut welfare systems, they deregulate. Then the Democrats come in, say, oh, return to normalcy, like Biden did after Trump's first term, and they don't reverse any of the harm. Maybe they promise they will, but they don't. They make a very weak handed attempt to fix things. The way I would most accurately describe this, um, the Democrats will only move things forward in society if you can make a perfectly worded, perfectly reasoned argument for why things need to change, which is an almost impossible standard. Sometimes people manage to do that, and then they'll change things. For instance, I'm getting a very personal example. I'm getting screwed by the Social Security Disability Insurance System. They have this stupid rule put in place by Clinton, by the way, in combination with Newt Gingrich in the 90s, saying that if you work for a university and you're a student, the university doesn't have to pay your payroll tax. You don't get Social Security disability insurance credit for the time you worked. You combine that with graduate students, which are future members of the labor aristocracies. This was really undermining his own voting base as a Democrat, and a lot of things Clinton did help make the Democrats weak ever since. So this is not the only thing he did. It's almost like he was really a Republican in disguise. This is why many, even Democrats, hate Clintons, because they have made the Democrats even weaker than they would like to be, and they prefer to be weak so they don't have to actually change anything in a positive direction, I think. But this system, it's unfair, it's discriminatory, it screws over anyone who's gone to grad school. I did work that literally would have been paying an apparel tax if I wasn't a student at the time. In fact, I did. Most of what I did as a TA, for instance, was test grading. I literally worked for a test grading company after I graduated, private, for profit, got payroll tax contributions. Did not get payroll tax contributions for grading while I was a student, even though I had more competing demands of my time, even though the exams were arguably harder to grade than standardized tests, even though I was also having to essentially do some tutoring of students, private tutors, uh, get payroll tax contributions. Standardized test graders for these companies, or if there's a university outsources grading of exams to a private company that's not worked by students, these produce payroll tax contributions. But if you work for the university, you don't. It's an unfair rule. But if I would ever try and say, take this to court and appeal it, the Republicans would just say, screw you. No matter how perfect an argument I made, they would fuck me over and refuse. But if you say I had a Democrat appointed judge, someone who fit with the Democratic mindset, they would be probably willing to let it go up and all the way up to the Supreme Court in theory if they're Democrat justices there, which right now there aren't. They're GOP ones, who would just screw me over no matter what. If I could get a really, really great lawyer who would be willing to help me, which basically means someone would do it for free because I have very little in the way of money, and make a perfectly reasoned argument, do a great job, be very charismatic, not have anything that could be used to attack me or say, oh, look at this guy. Probably they would mock my appearance or whatever thing. It doesn't matter. If I could manage to be impervious to any attack and make a perfectly reasoned argument, I'd probably be able to get change, but only under those conditions. The Democrats are fundamentally a conservative party in the sense that they wish, not in the sense of conserving the power of the rich, which is one version of the word, but in the sense that they don't wish for things to change very fast. They will not move things backwards usually, but they will barely move things forward at such a snail's pace that they will never undo the damage that the last Republican administration did. Even if they have 3 successive Democrat terms, they will not undo the damage of a single GOP administration most of the time. And then once the Republicans come back to power, that just makes things worse, and things will slide further and further and further to the right in U.S. politics. And that's the role of the Democrats. They will not change anything unless there's a perfectly worded argument. This goes partly along with their labor aristocracy voting base. And the labor aristocracy understand everything has to be well reasoned. They have a lot of professors, engineers who vote for them. So, except maybe defense engineers who would tend to vote Republican. So, like I said, no one group will always vote a certain way. It gets, if someone's racist, they might vote GOP when they normally vote Democrat. Or if they're very anti-racist, if they're a minority, they might tend to vote Democrat when they're petit bourgeois, might normally tend to vote Republican. It all gets more complicated when you look at individuals, but the general patterns definitely hold. And keeping with the labor aristocracy routes, the Democrats will demand near perfection. Just like if you've ever had a really jerk professor and you're appealing an exam grading, and now I'm talking about more of my experience as a student, less as TA, because I was a rather understanding TA with how the grading worked and tried to be very fair. I did a lot of partial credit where a lot of people might give fully no credit for things that were partially correct. But you get a really jerk professor, and if you want to, do a regrade request, you're gonna have to make a perfectly reasoned argument, or they're not going to give you anything. They may even take points away penalty. I've had professors who do that, who will intentionally look for other things and try and steal points from you for daring to take their time up. Even if you're right, you're clearly right. If you didn't make a perfectly reasoned argument, they will screw you over. I had someone who literally tried to pretend that they didn't understand how basic percentages work. There was an exam question where something increases by 200% or by 100% or by 300%. And if you know what percentages mean, if something increases by 200%, it triples. If it increases by 300%, it quadruples. That is, you have something increases by 200%, you have 3 times the original value at the end, because by 100% increase doesn't mean something stays the same, it means it doubles. That's where it becomes most obvious. So because they were both multiple choice answers, the correct answer was not the one that was marked in the exam as such. And even when I tried to go with this very basic, what do these percentages mean, this professor was refusing to give ground because he was so egotistical. And because in this case, maybe I didn't quite approach it in a way that could fit with his ego, even though I had a perfectly reasoned argument. That goes along with the attitude of the Democrats. You have to make a perfectly reasoned argument. You have to not infringe on their egos. It's very difficult to get them to change anything, and so change happens very slow. Mind you, this isn't the only model, the one I've just described. You get these revisionists and these anti-Marxists, and they'll push things like the Gilbert model. You can see here sociology. A lot. Karl Marx was actually a very key contributor to the development of sociology. The conflict school of economics is considered to derive from him, but people later took things in other directions, tried to move away from the Marxist roots of parts of sociology because Cold War, because anti-communism bullshit. Max Weber was critical of some of Marx's work and started to move. And out of all this comes the Gilbert model, and this is maybe the more refined version of the capitalist way of looking at things. We have upper class, the petite, sorry, the high bourgeoisie, the true bourgeois, and you can even see they're like 0.1% here. The upper middle class, which really be a lot of the labor aristocracy and wealthier petite bourgeois. The middle class, which might still contain some of the petite bourgeois, working, working poor, and the underclass, i.e. the lumpen proletariat. Some of these are literally just renaming terms. Like this is very clearly lumpen proletariat. This is very clearly labor aristocracy and petite bourgeois. Um, just to avoid using Marxist terms for them. And then it's emphasizing lifestyles and culture capital. It's bullshit. And this allows the idea of the professional managerial class, which the more you read about it, it's more and more clear they're just renaming labor aristocracy. And it's literally see also labor aristocracy at the bottom. These people just, this is what Michael Parenti will call an anything but class analysis, which I recommend reading his book, Black Shirts and Reds. It's great, and it looks at that. But I wanted to point, you will see other models floating around behind the stupid three-part model, which is absolutely inaccurate, or the Gilbert model, which breaks things up more into a larger number of subclasses, and it's still inaccurate. It's just an attempt to move away from anything that might be considered Marxist. And the reason is to undermine socialism ultimately, because people use this model instead, and it's closer to reality without being Marxist still, then the hope is that people can't even make Marxist arguments and can't vote for socialist parties and can't undermine the power of the high bourgeoisie ultimately. People like that who made the Gilbert model, they're just a great example of the labor aristocracy collaborating with the super rich, with the true bourgeoisie at any cost, just to prevent the end of capitalism and their loss of status and privilege. And it's ironic because if you look at actual social systems, such as, say, the Soviet Union, the people who were labor aristocracy and capitalism still held enormous privilege and power within the Soviet Union. Engineers, scientists, doctors, they still enjoyed much better working conditions, much better pay, because not everyone made the same money in the Soviet Union. That's a lie by people who know nothing about it. What it was is you couldn't hire other people and pay them less than what they were producing in value. Most businesses were owned by the state. Some more cooperatives started to form in the later part of the Soviet era. So they weren't even all state-owned businesses, and there was some limited amount of like small farmers who were allowed after the collectivization efforts and farms petered out. So not every, so there were a very limited number of what may be considered small businessmen. There was even a tiny petite bourgeois really in the Soviet Union, but the labor aristocracy still very much existed. There were still engineers and such, people who, by virtue of the higher productivity they had due to their skills, were paid better, of course. The children didn't have the same privileged position where the children of doctors are very, very likely to become doctors. Many med schools will actually favor their children admissions in the United States, for instance. None of that in the Soviet Union. It was very meritocratic in the true sense of the most qualified would be able to take the most privileged, important positions. And what's more, in attempts to specifically what might be called affirmative action like programs, which actually the Soviet Union invented and the capitalist West copied affirmative action and now has gotten rid of it. But the Soviets had a kind of affirmative action program for people from the countryside, from rural areas, where they were specifically given advantage in admissions, where even if their exam scores were lower, they might get into better university programs to account for the worst quality of rural schools. Even though the Soviets tried to equalize the difference between rural and urban schools, make the rural schools better, they weren't able to completely remove that, so they had a kind of affirmative action program as well. And also they would advantage some underrepresented minorities, ethnic minorities, language minorities in the Soviet Union as well, which is something that's not talked about because when either it would be used to attack affirmative action in the capitalist West or make people realize that the Soviet Union wasn't as bad as people say it was. That a lot of what we hear is this bullshit propaganda. So yeah, labor aristocracy still exists in the Soviet Union. They still enjoyed higher economic and political power than the rest of society, though less in the way of political power. They still enjoyed higher wages, though. Um, the whatever enhanced political power they enjoyed, it was more along the lines of when they had mass meetings and when people were electing local representatives, and you would have these like town hall style meetings to elect local representatives who would elect regional ones, elect higher level regional ones who would elect. It would all go all the way to Supreme Soviet at the end, and they would elect the small council that actually made decisions in the Soviet Union. It was not an autocracy. Anyone who claims like Stalin was an absolute dictator, that's a lie. He ruled the Soviet Union with a group of about 12 people. That those 12 people had almost contested power, but Stalin could be and often was overruled by the other members of that small council, about 12. It was a very powerful oligarchy, but um, not an absolute dictatorship, and it was what's more not a plutocratic oligarchy. It wasn't ruled by wealth. It was ruled by, if you will, merit or political power. Still not a perfect system. Oligarchy runs against what Marxists should be trying to accomplish, but it was an oligarchy more based on factors that weren't the circumstances of your birth. Stalin himself was literally half Georgian, as in Georgia, the country, and had been a bank robber for a while, for instance. He was not born into wealth and privilege. And many of the other members of the ruling council, same thing. Some of them were half Ukrainian, some of them were half Kazakh. I don't know if when Stalin was alive, there were half Kazakhs on the council then, but there were before or after his time. Um, People from Kazakhstan and Ukraine actually were overrepresented on the council, the ruling council of the Soviet Union, more than their numbers in the population should have led to. Most often, they were half this group and that. They were inter-ethnic marriages, because that gave me a unique perspective that tended to lead them rising up through the ranks as they could understand both groups to some degree. Anyways, I mean, there were also a disproportionate number of Jews, which is what led to dumb fascist Judeo-Bolshevik theory nonsense. Um, that's a conspiracy theory. Communism was an attempt to destroy the West by Jews. It's fucking racist bullshit. But there were a disproportionate number of Jews. If 1 out of 8 people in the Soviet Union were Jewish, then 1 out of 6 on the ruling council were Jewish, kind of thing. Minorities were generally speaking overrepresented, partly because going back to the Tsarist era, the Tsars oppressed everyone who was a minority. So these people tended to become communists earlier. And so they'd already been communists for 10, 20 years and the revolution broke out. So that's another reason they were overrepresented early on. Just because these people had already been opposing the Tsars for a long time. And had already moved into Marxism earlier than the rest. Anyways, so like a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer might have I didn't really have many other ways of what we think of as lawyers now, but doctor, an engineer, an advocate, these people um, might have disproportionate power in these town halls just by virtue of their social status. If they speak, people are going to listen to them. So they may have more political power, but it was less in the sense of I can make campaign donations, because that didn't exist in the Soviet Union, which, a doctor can make campaign donations. They can afford to make some to their local politicians, stuff like that. That gives them more power than just their social status alone would warrant. And less entrenched, their children are going to have better status than their children's children. So it was more people listen to them because they respect their intelligence, kind of thing, or they respect their position in society. More egalitarian than what we have, more equal distribution of power. A final thought here. If any of you ever have played Stellaris, the game, you see what's known as living standards in the system. It's levels of economic and political stratification in society, basically. And it's worth noting the ruling class or the rulers in that game, um, the level of their political economic power compared to the rest of the population, first of all, they're far too numerous. They can easily make up like 2% of a planet's population, when realistically, if they represent the high bourgeoisie, it'd be like 0.2%. But second, their share of the political and economic power, specifically consumer goods and political power, which is actually a attribute described to population, is far less, far less than what it would be under any capitalist system in terms of how stratified. Even under the stratified economy system, it's still far more equal than, say, the United States today, which could be thought of as either game design. It wouldn't be fun if it was realistic, but it could also be thought of, and this is why I wanted to mention, as a commentary that no society could ever make it to become a spacefaring civilization that spreads across the galaxy, true spacefaring civilization, unless it was able to at least reach a level of greater level of equality than any capitalist country on Earth has right now, pretty much, because the levels of stratification we have in most capitalist countries are completely unsustainable. They will destroy themselves. This is why I hate people saying, "Oh, I there's some utterly delusional people in my life, like my mother, who will never listen when you say the system is collapsing, or will listen for a second, then go right back to her previous way of talking and believing. She thinks, oh, just Democrats come in, everything go back to normal. No, there's a ratchet effect. So even if the Democrats come in and they get elected for 16 straight years, they won't undo all the damage Trump did in just 4. But the other thing is that even if someone could come in and by some miraculous, you know, force of effort and will and leadership, the United States could roll back its march towards collapse by 80 years to about where we were, in 1945, which, keep in mind, 45 was not a great period for everyone. I'm not arguing it was, amazing. There are a lot of oppressed minorities and such, but one of the things about 45 is the United States was on an upward trajectory. Even though there was still a lot of inequality, even racial minorities understood that things were slowly getting better, that they might have a chance in the future of greater rights like they did in the civil rights era. There was optimism in a sense, things were getting better, and that improved the stability of the system. Even if we could reach a similar level of stability, which we'd have to have things in terms of economic equality go back to like 45 maybe, but in terms of obviously racial and stuff, things would have to not get worse, because even if we got back to that level of inequality and such, things would probably immediately start decaying again. And so it wouldn't have the optimism that the U.S. had in the 1940s, where we just won World War II in the late 40s. And people thought everything was just going to get better forever. And that's not true, as we've seen. Even if the clock was somehow rolled back 80 years, things would just end up right where they are again now, 80 years after. Capitalism always marched in this direction. It's unsustainable. And maybe in the second time around, it would have been very lucky to turn back 80 years once. Probably would have failed to happen a second time, and then it would have just collapsed again. The U.S., I try not to be overly dramatic, but I've also seen the immense cruelty of our system. I studied viruses in grad school. This is when I was TAing and such. I can tell you that, for instance, the ruling class very much knew the danger of something like a coronavirus, and should have been, from the moment that COVID started peeking its head out, they should have immediately been alert, and there should have been a lot more drastic action taken to deal with it. There wasn't to protect the interests of the rich. So I've seen the cruelty of that. I've seen people in welfare. I was an EMT. I've seen how the lumpen proletariat live long before I got stable and became one myself. I have seen the cruelty, the malice, the irrationality of capitalism. I can say the system does not have long to live. It continuously gets worse, and things can only get worse for so long before they collapse. There will not still be democracy in the United States by 2065. It, maybe it'll go a few more cycles of this. Republican makes things worse, Democrat comes and makes things marginally better, but doesn't undo the damage of the last Republican administration. Then people get annoyed because the Democrats aren't fixing things at a noticeable rate, and then another Republican comes into power, 12 years later. This is just going to keep happening until things collapse. It's pretty much guaranteed. If things don't go fascist under Trump this term, assuming he doesn't somehow undermine the Constitution, try to do more in 2 terms, then things won't get better under whatever Democrat comes next, if it's a Democrat after Trump, and then things will get worse again. the next time a Republican is power. This system cannot sustain itself. Um, which is why I've said, and many Marxists will tell you, it's socialism or barbarism. The United States people can develop class consciousness, they can move towards Marxism, they can fix what the rot at the core of the system, which is the exploitation of people and the stealing of their surplus value. They hand it to a handful of basically billionaires and multimillionaires who then corrupt democracy and create a class structure like the labor aristocracy and the petit bourgeois in the way they promise to help them in exchange for the collaboration controlling society. A class structure that, you know, is allows dominance and is ultimately destroying society, and no aspect of American society is untouched or uncorrupted by capitalism at this point. It's only going to get worse. Um, People can stick with that, or they can move to Marxism and undo the rot at the core of the system. That's the choice. Unfortunately, I'm not thinking socialism is feasible anymore. I think with Trump getting elected a second time, any hope of that was killed because he's going to move things so far to the right. I'm not some accelerationist. I don't think the worse things get, the more people realize socialism is necessary. I think there may be a sweet spot where a certain level of dysfunctionality, but still some room for people to breathe, allows change to happen. But we're going past that sweet spot. People already see that the system is dysfunctional, but they're getting so desperate to survive. You're having more of the proletariat be pushed into the lumpen proletariat every year. You're having the petit bourgeois becoming ever more desperate about their class position and more likely to vote for fascism every year. So we're getting to the point where change is not feasible. I personally like to get out of the United States, which is why I need this YouTube channel to succeed. I need subscribers so I can make ad money, so I can maybe go to a country in Europe and say, I think my country is going fascist, or maybe it's already gone to the point. I wish to be a refugee. I can support myself off of YouTube ad money. Please let me in, because stable with long COVID, I can't work normal jobs. It's my best hope. So, yeah, recommend the channel to your friends. Tell them to subscribe. I hope you enjoy this. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. And may you always find a kind start leading home. Until next time, this is Northstar. Adieu.